Good afternoon, everybody. I mentioned yesterday the toughest session is the one after lunch. I'd like to change that to say the toughest session is the one before lunch. So if we are the only ones holding you back, please forgive us. We're going to wrap up in exactly 19 minutes and 45 seconds. The discussion today is talking about we are undergoing many fundamental changes in the way we are investing. So three of us run venture capital firms. Some people refer to us as vulture capitalists, but ignore that. So we're here trying to make a difference and create capital that helps in building the startup ecosystem. And we've seen a significant change that's come about. I think one of the biggest things that we are accused of is that we've sort of taken a venture capital model that's worked in the US, which is typically an 8 to 9 year fund cycle, and the desired outcome of how we are measured as success is how many quote-unquote unicorns we have in our portfolio. So I think what we're going to talk about is does that model really work in India? Do we need to have a different model? And now that we're getting into solving real hardware, infrastructural problem, do we need more patient capital? So with that in mind, we're going to also talk about is that when we talk about raising capital from, we refer to them as LPs or limited partners. Is there a difference in the way LPs are treating this asset class now, and are they becoming patient? Because they also sort of compare us to the public markets, which are fully liquid. So before I start, I'd like to give an opportunity for my panelists to sort of give a brief introduction about themselves and the fund and sort of the thesis that they have, and then we'll get into Q&A. Anjali?
Thank you so much, Kunal and Ranjit. Thank you for inviting me to this event. So quick introduction. I'm Anjali. I'm from Bangalore. I'm an early stage consumer and fintech investor. And as a firm, Waterbridge Ventures is also the classic early stage VC. We do about $1 to $3 million checks in, let's say, idea stage companies or no companies really too early for us, pre-revenue, pre-product, pre-PMF. And we focus on three broad themes. One is frontier tech, deep tech, which is SaaS, AI, and your more climate sustainability deep tech. The second theme is what I focus on, which is consumption and the wider gig economy. It could be India for India or even consumer brands that we're exporting. And our third theme is digitizing supply chains and distribution. So a broad lens of tech-led digital disruption at the early stage.
Ranjit?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Ranjit Menon. I'm a partner at a fund called Chirate Ventures. We are India's largest homegrown venture capital fund. We manage about $1.3 billion. Been investing in India for the last 18, 19 years now. Backed some companies, very, very lucky, I should say, to have backed some companies that have gone on to become extremely big. Think Myntra, Flipkart, Lenskart, FirstCry, and so on and so forth. Our typical check sizes range from $500,000, can go up to $6-7 million. Traditionally, we've been focused on investing in software, in fintech, healthcare, and consumer tech. This particular fund that we're currently investing out of also has a focus around deep tech, and that's an area that we're very, very excited about. Yeah, very, very happy to be here.
Great, thank you. I'll start with you, Ranjit. You mentioned you're one of the largest and probably one of the first predominantly raised domestic capital. So I guess I wanted to ask you, being a pioneer in raising domestic or LP capital, have you seen changes in their thought process in terms of has your domestic LP's tolerance for being patient, giving you a longer time to create value for has that changed over time, or do you think that is something that's still a difficult sell?
Yeah, so Kunal, I think we've seen this seesaw, and I'll give you some context here. We started raising domestic capital around 2013. I mean, Fund 2 is when we really reached out to domestic investors, and when we started that process, we were really, laughed at, saying that Indian, investors just cannot understand this asset class. You're locking this capital for 10 years. Illiquidity and just won't work, and so on and so forth, right? The reason we started this was simply because we were called IDG when we started, and IDG is extremely large in China, right? And if you study IDG and the China ecosystem, the RMB capital is plays a very significant role in China. And so we really thought maybe it is time for capital from India to kind of support companies here. And around the same time, we had this massive exit from Flipkart, right? When Walmart acquired Flipkart, and we were the only ones on that cap table that had domestic capital. So the whole business that was built on Indian ecosystem, there was nobody who benefited. Of course, the founders and the employees did, but no investor did. So that really got us thinking. And it was extremely hard. Nobody understood this. Fund 2, we had 20% domestic capital, right? And then by the time we reached Fund 4, this whole startup thing had exploded and everybody wanted a piece of this. And you saw domestic capital participation go significantly up, right? And then came the downfall where people said, now I'm not getting any returns, right? Because it takes longer. And so there was a calibration. And then that's when a lot more institutional framework, institutional came into domestic capital, which we saw with the banks and the corporates and so on and so forth. Now, it is still very early days for domestic capital because these cycles are long. People have not seen this full cycles play out in VC and so on and so forth. Even if you think about our 2013 vintage fund, we are towards the end of that fund here. So we're just seeing about the first full fund cycle here, right? The good news is that there is significant interest in the asset class. There is significant experience. We are talking about large corporates, family houses who have built companies from India. So they understand what it takes to build something from India, build it for long. So that's the good news, right? But valuations, technology, these things are stuff that they're still getting used to. And the other piece is also a lot of people think this is easy to do. They're saying, okay, we will set up a family office which will do direct investments, right? That's another theme that we're seeing with this one. And I always tell these people, you really have to think as to why a Mukesh Bansal of Myntra or a Piyush Bansal of Lenskart would come to the family office, right? Before going to the whole bunch of available funds that are there. And so what is that they can bring? And so just setting up a family office is not, and you will fail and you will blame the asset class, right? So I think the way to really think about it is there are family offices today whose understanding and majority of this ecosystem, of this asset class is good, and they're willing to wait. They're willing to wait. But there are also people who are, who've got into this because it's fashionable, and then now struggling to figure out how to, make sure the returns happen and the IRRs and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So I think it's always good for all the family offices out there. Remember, please trust your capital with professionals. Don't try to make direct investments. So I second that. Anjali, Waterbridge, like all of us, operate typically in that 9 to 12 year kind of investment cycle. So just a couple of questions around that is that, does that sort of limit your ability to pick sectors in which you want to invest in? See, consumer tech gains traction very fast. We all operate in that. So is that a limiting factor? Number one. Number two is that, do you typically have sort of pressure from your LPs to start generating and returning capital more? And is that something that sort of limited your ability to fund businesses that you truly believe in?
No, I think everyone's always under pressure to return money. But I think you briefly alluded to it in your opening comments that I think it's almost using the wrong lens to look at the wrong market. And if you look at Chirate, as Ranjit said, is like the earliest and the original homegrown VC firm is still less than 2 decades old, right? And they've not even celebrated their 20th birthday and seen 2 full fund cycles. But a direct answer to that question would be, if you statistically ask, yes, an IPO today for a tech-led VC-backed startup is taking, say, 12 to 13 years on an average. In some cases, it's going up to 17, 20 years as well. But that has changed, and that pace itself has also accelerated post-COVID. So what used to be a 17, 20-year time frame is now shrunk to, say, 12 to 14 years. But truth be told, if you go back and look at the US IPO data as well, it's not very different. It's still very much a decade-long path to IPO. It's just that what's happened in the US in the last 2 decades because of the QE era is that there was the Fed balance sheet just kept ballooning, and all that capital went into large, late-stage, growth funds. And for early-stage funds like us, therefore, there was, let's say, a liquidity or an exit event outside of IPOs, and you could traditionally just sell to the large growth funds and exit. Of course, it created a different problem of keeping, private companies private longer and led to the valuation level, but that's a different tale for another day. But in India, very much, we don't have that depth in secondaries yet. And of course, we know the M&A market as well doesn't give us the billion-dollar outcomes we're looking for, which means it is still predominantly the IPO-led exit route for all of us, which comes back to the original statement of, yes, it is going to take 12 to 15 years to get us those outcomes. But that is not because there are any fundamental flaws in the ecosystem. I think it's only because of maturity and stage and the fact that we're actually really, really young overall as an ecosystem and haven't seen those cycles. But I think all the momentum of the last 2 years is just positive signaling that we are still early and ahead on that curve, and the best, I would say, is yet to come. Yeah.
Great. So Ranjit, back to you. Let's talk a little bit about conviction metrics beyond revenues. My question is basically talk about philosophy of capital with conviction, which is basically what we are into. If you're prioritizing long-term value as opposed to short, quick wins, especially in sectors like health tech or specialized B2B, which is an area that you're focusing on, what are some of the non-financial signals or metrics that you look for early on in your sort of journey with each founder / portfolio companies that allows you to sort of get confidence that this is a founder that's building for the long term and not sort of taking and achieve or focusing on short-term wins?
So Kunal, I think, not every company is, can be built for an IPO. I mean, that's very clear, especially when you start getting into, deep tech and stuff like that, which is very core tech businesses. And founders who are, when you meet a founder, where his strength is, right? Whether it is in building a product or what, can he also build the distribution network, the business, and so on and so forth. So even before we enter into a company, there is a sort of an understanding as to how potentially this can play out in some time. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that, the philosophy that we have at our fund is, can we invest into companies that become institutions over a period of time? But not every company is there. And I'll give you an example. We are investors in this company called Ather. It develops a bionic arm. Okay. And it's, and so it's very clear, very young guys who built this piece, very little understanding of distribution, partnerships, and how do you go about this. So the focus is really on technology, on the roadmap, the product roadmap, what they can build. And outside of revenue, we also look at, in this particular case, publications that they can put, because it's, around medical and usage and so on and so forth. So there are metrics that we would look at outside of revenue in companies where that's not the way we want to. Company building is focused on the product, technology, publications, trials, clinical trials, and so on and so forth, as against to saying that how do you build a distribution network, head of sales, how do you go to the US and sell, and so on and so forth, right? So those are, again, very specific. If you think about healthcare, then those things become more important, because then you're saying, okay, who else is there in this space? Who are the largest guys? How do you build, a business development into a potential acquirer who can know you, who's tracking you, so those kind of things become more important than actually saying that what is the revenue potential for this, and how do we build that network for building revenue, and that's the way we would approach some of these companies. And there are companies that is very clear from the very beginning that it can become extremely large in a period of 12, 13 years. Like, Lenskart took us 13 years. FirstCry was, I think, 14 years or so, right? But it was very clear from the beginning that this is where it is going to go. And then you build for that from a long-term perspective. But there are companies which are smaller, which are more focused on M&A, which is harder to execute though. It's much more harder to execute, but not every company would go down the full distance.
Great points. So there are founders in the room, so it's just, yeah, I think these are absolutely pearls of wisdom. So Anjali, so, WaterBridge does a lot of work in emerging towns, the Bharat and all of that. And I guess that's investing in that category or that sector requires significantly longer gestation periods because you're literally building the entire infrastructure, delivery modules, etc. And you're struggling with low AOVs. Cost of acquisition is still high. So it's basically something that you're specializing in and you're going pretty much against the grain of what a majority of other VCs are funding in India, or India One as they call it. So when you go and pitch this idea to your LPs that we're going to be focusing and going against the grain, do you see a lot of pushback, or do you see VCs, your LPs coming to you and see that they appreciate that you have a differentiated strategy and they support what you want to do?
I think until last week there were several slides, and last week Misha answered a lot of those questions, and we just need one slide and one case study now. But no, jokes apart, I think I always joke saying what we call internally as value TAM, which is basically India beyond the top 25 large metros and big urban centers. We call it value TAM, and it isn't underserved tier A, right? And it just is it's a fundamentally different market with different intrinsics and different first principles that have to be looked at and evaluated as such. And if you try to apply the traditional VC metrics of what's your CAC LTV payback, will I get it back in 6 months or within 12 months? It isn't going to work. So I think similar to deep tech, where the early metrics need to be different or non-traditional or non-vanity, so to speak. With the value market as well, we've seen that even, for example, unit economics obsession may not even work. It's probably cohort economics, and it'll be cash flow positivity before EBITDA positivity. And Misho again has shown us that you'll probably be cash positive first and then EBITDA positive much later. But there are a lot of these nuts and bolts that are just different with the way the business will behave. And in these, what we call LV, HV market, which is low value, high volume markets, even monetization therefore won't be your traditional transaction-led fees or just a single type of hook that will lead to monetizing users. So you'll have to try at least 3-4 different channels of monetization beyond just a straightforward take rate or a license fee, etc. So I think both from customer demand side as well as the way you build the business, scale it as founders, tech will probably be more to drive internal operational efficiencies and not so much to digitally acquire customers. And in this business, I think in this segment, customers are really, the consideration time is significant. So it takes you a really long time to convince these users to adopt. So there's significant inertia, and it takes you a while to invest in either customer education or adoption or just get that change behavior to adopt. But once that happens, you really see the retention curves beautifully flattening out. So I don't think this is economics or profitability or IRR denied. It's just that the curves look different. And for value TAM or beyond urban, it will be more like the J curves. But end of the day, it's just, are you running a 100-meter dash or a long marathon? But there's still a gold medal at the end of it, yeah.
Great. I think we just have time for some rapid-fire questions. It seems to be the theme. Everybody seems to do that, Karan Johar style. So basically, I'm going to ask you both the same question. I think there is an accusation that VCs have a herd mentality. Predominantly, we're driven by FOMO, and we copy-paste each other. And so I think this is an opportunity for both of you to sort of answer differently and prove that you have a unique strategy of investing, especially when it comes to long-term capital and conviction. So I'm going to ask Anjali first, and then Ranjit can. So let's talk about patience versus speed. Would you prefer an IPO or a strategic acquisition? Which is better if you're deploying patient capital?
I'm a consumer investor, so I'm tempted to say IPO. So.
No, I think clearly IPO a bit. You are building an institution for a longer period. I mean, it's just not about just flipping it and making money. Of course, that's also important. I mean, DPI is important from an investor standpoint, but I think joy is that when you ring the bell. So.
Okay. The next question is around founder DNA. What's the biggest red flag that you see in a founder in terms of his quality that will show you that this founder lacks patient builder DNA?
I'd say open to feedback. I mean, not justly from a VC but just generally from the market. If he's not open to feedback, we've seen founders who think they know almost everything, is not, listening. Very, very difficult to manage, and that has an impact on what he's building, the quality of the team that he's putting together, it will be a struggle.
Anjali?
I'll probably say cycles, just their ability to have seen cycles. I think we know now that in India, entrepreneur quality is just significantly, we're seeing a lot of 2x entrepreneurs come back now. But ideally, somebody who's not seen cycles, or just, I guess, the inverse of the ability to take feedback is the ability to embrace failure.
Okay, let's talk about unit economics. Option A is 0% gross margin. Option B is 24 months before your first paying customer. Which, according to you, is more an acceptable risk?
It really depends on the company, Kunal. I mean, see, if you're investing in quick commerce, for example, I mean, to think about gross margin and all of that is very difficult. I'll give you, it's a long answer. It's not like rapid fire, but FirstCry, when we invested on a minus 8% gross margin business, minus 8% gross margin, right? It went public. So, I mean, it takes time, right? But if you are a product company, D2C brand, and at a contribution level, you might be losing. But if your gross margins are not 50% upwards, then you will struggle even if you scale. So, it really depends on the business.
I would say it depends, but it's okay if you're negative or even zero revenue in the early years, as long as you take Ranjit's point one on, are you listening to feedback from all stakeholders, from customers, etc., and there's like a path. But I always like to say cash is king or queen. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about VC structure. For you to deliver superior returns, would you prefer to stick to the current 9-year funds, go to 15 years, or if you had the luxury of an evergreen fund?
I'd say evergreen fund for sure.
Yeah.
There is a certain discipline of returning capital. As long as we stick to that, I think, but evergreen funds, because you have time to build, and the choices that you make and the kind of, businesses that you would back, I think would make a difference.
Evergreen will also make us pretty lazy, I'm being honest with you.
That's precisely why I said the discipline to return capital.
Okay.
I think we still need to be there.
So the last question is the cost of patience. What's the highest percentage of a round you would let your founder allocate to R&D? Now we're all talking about that's the key to success. Is there a number, or you think that it really doesn't matter?
Again, it goes back to the business, right? I mean, if you're building Zepto, then R&D is it's not so much. But if you're building a space tech company, then you would want a lot of money going there. We are a tech-focused fund, so our bias will be in terms of how big your tech team is, what your investments there are, irrespective of where you are, because we really believe tech can solve for a lot of things, whether you're doing a consumer business to deep tech. So, I mean, the higher it is, we believe it will be the better.
I think same. I think a broader principle we use at WaterBridge is, have you budgeted in for the cost of failures or the cost of experiments? And that would apply if you're consumer, fintech, deep tech, any of it. And even in the consumer world, like primary insights, far and few founders actually invest that time and budgets to get structured, formal primary insights. So it is important, but yeah, I would say cost of mistakes and cost of experiments into your business plan.
Great. I think we've run out of time. Thank you again. Thanks, Anjali, Ranjit. And unfortunately, no time for Q&A, but we are all available. Well, they're available, and I'm available as well if anybody wants to chat after the session. Thank you.